The York brothers, Edward IV, Richard III, then Duke of Gloucester, and George, Duke of Clarence, share a fascinating yet often overlooked peculiarity: their weddings. Each brother married in relative secrecy, and each of their unions caused divisions within the family. Remarkably, none of these marriages conform to the grandeur and public spectacle we associate with royal weddings today, customs that were well established even in their own time. Welcome back to Lemmy History. I am happy that you are here. Today, let's try to learn how the Wars of the Roses shaped the wedding days of kings and princes, and how an event that was meant to bring families together tore them apart, and with them, the whole realm. Among the three brides, one stands out almost as prominently as her husband, Edward IV, Elizabeth Woodville. Her impact on English history is profound and enduring. In contrast, the wives of Edward's brothers, George and Richard, remain relatively obscure. Both of these women were daughters of the so-called kingmaker, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. George married Isabel Neville, while Richard took Anne Neville as his wife. In this video, we will compare these weddings, highlight their shared traits, and then delve into the details of each ceremony. Understanding these marriages is crucial for comprehending Tudor history and the turbulent events of 1483. By examining these weddings, we gain insights into the factors that shaped not just personal relationships, but also the course of English history. We'll discuss this in greater depth by the end of the video. The first commonality among the three York brothers' weddings is a particularly frustrating one. Despite these being the marriages of a king and his two brothers, we know surprisingly little about the events themselves. In none of the cases is the exact date certain. While a fixed date is often given for Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, this has recently been called into question, a topic we'll explore in the chapter about their wedding. For George and Isabel, we can at least narrow the date down to 2 days. However, for Richard and Anne, the timing is even more obscure. We only know that the wedding must have taken place within an 11-month window. All three weddings were considered secret, largely because there were people who opposed the matches, or whose permission was required but not granted. Edward famously concealed his marriage from his nobility, especially Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who was negotiating a politically advantageous match for him in France. George required Edward's approval for his marriage but faced opposition. George disapproved of Richard's marriage. Furthermore, one of the necessary papal dispensations for Richard's union was missing. None of the weddings featured a grand celebration. While there is a report claiming that George and Isabel's wedding was an exception, this source, penned by George Emilius Crauchete Sandeman, raises significant doubts. For example, Sandeman claims Richard III made grants 2 years after he died, a detail that casts doubt on the reliability of his account. In contrast, Jean de Wavrin, who was present at the time, described the event as having not many people in attendance. It is worth noting that some accounts claim Wavrin left 7 days before George and Isabel's actual wedding, but this assertion is incorrect. The full guest lists for these weddings remain unknown. For Richard and Anne, even identifying individual attendees is uncertain. Despite the controversial nature of these marriages, none were ever formally investigated by an ecclesiastical court. Edward and Elizabeth's marriage faced particularly vocal challenges in 1483, and by 1484, doubts about its validity had even been codified into law. However, the legal step necessary to formally annul the marriage was never taken. Another shared trait among the brothers' marriages is that all three wed subjects of the king, a highly unusual practice at the time. Royal marriages traditionally sought foreign princesses to secure alliances. Edward, for example, arranged for his sister Margaret to marry the Duke of Burgundy. Unintentionally, the York brothers' marriages marked a significant turning point in royal customs. Henry Tudor, who married Elizabeth of York, also wed an Englishwoman. Furthermore, 4 of Henry's son's 6 wives were his subjects. These unions reshaped the political culture of the realm, giving leading noble families the unprecedented possibility of marrying their daughters into the royal family. This new dynamic caused tension among the nobility, as questions arose about whether a family's name was worthy of such a connection. In the case of Edward and Elizabeth, the answer from the political establishment was an emphatic and resounding no, a theme we will examine in detail as we delve into their marriage. Elizabeth Woodville came from a noble family, far from the commoner she is often portrayed as. However, a marriage into the royal family, especially to the king himself, seemed unattainable. Her first husband, Lord John Grey, was a more fitting match for her social standing. Even her mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, a prominent figure who once held the second highest rank in the kingdom after Queen Margaret of Anjou, did not change this perception. It is believed that Edward and Elizabeth may have first crossed paths during Edward's childhood. Born in Rouen, Edward grew up while his father served in France, where Richard Woodville, Elizabeth's father, was also present with his family. This connection suggests that the families were not only acquainted, but likely interacted, explaining why Richard Woodville later became part of Edward's Privy Council, even before the marriage. The Wars of the Roses temporarily divided the families, as the Woodvilles supported the Lancastrian cause. Yet Edward did not hold this against them. He and Elizabeth met again in 1464, after she faced issues with her first husband's family over inheritance. Seeking help, she approached William Hastings to intervene on her behalf with the king. An agreement was reached on April 13, 1464. But it is said to have been unnecessary following a fateful meeting between Elizabeth and Edward. According to legend, Elizabeth, accompanied by her 2 sons, waited beneath an oak tree where she knew Edward would pass. She directly appealed to him for help, and he was captivated by her beauty, desiring an intimate relationship. Elizabeth, however, refused, declaring she would only be with a husband. The encounter allegedly involved a dagger, adding an air of drama to the story. Edward ultimately agreed to marry Elizabeth in secret. The wedding is said to have occurred on May 1st, 1464. On that day, Edward, who was in Stony Stratford, excused himself from his companions, claiming he wanted to go hunting alone. Instead, he travelled to a small chapel in Grafton, where, according to Robert Fabian, his bride, her mother, 2 gentlewomen, and a young boy, who helped the priest sing, awaited him. Fabian writes that Edward knew exactly what to do after the ceremony. After which spousals ended, Edward went to bed, and so tired there 3 or 4 hours, and after departed and rode again to Stony Stratford, and came as though he had been hunting, and there went to bed again. On September 28th of that year, Edward revealed at a council meeting in Reading Abbey that he was already married. This revelation completely undermined Warwick, damaging his reputation at the French royal court, and making it clear that he no longer held the king's trust. By the following year, Elizabeth was crowned queen. The secrecy of the wedding has never been disputed, supporting the assumption that it was a small, private affair. Beyond Fabian's brief account, no other descriptions of the ceremony have survived. The date of the wedding has recently been questioned for 2 reasons. First, April 30th was St. Walpurga's Eve, a date tied to superstition and, allegedly, Jacquetta's practice of black magic. Ricardian author Wee Hampton speculated in 1980 that Jacquetta bewitched Edward. He even suggested that Edward's return to bed in Stony Stratford, apparently tired, was due to the orgiastic nature of the rites to which he may have been introduced. Those who dismiss the idea of witchcraft argue that the date may have been deliberately chosen to support later allegations against the Woodvilles. Second, the place and date present an uncanny coincidence. Nearly 19 years later, Richard III took control of Edward V at this same location, arresting Elizabeth's brother Anthony, Earl Rivers, and her son Richard Grey. Additionally, discussions about making Thomas Grey the ward of William Hastings in August 1464 seem illogical if Elizabeth had already married the king. This has led to speculation that Edward and Elizabeth initially had an affair intended to go no further. When Elizabeth became pregnant, Edward may have hastily decided to marry her, perhaps just days before the council meeting, hoping to secure the succession through a son. Edward's decision solved several political problems as well. Margaret of Anjou was an unpopular queen, and there was resistance to the idea of Edward marrying a French princess. Edward also disliked Warwick's growing political influence, particularly as a Neville family feud threatened to escalate. Reaching out to the Lancastrian followers by marrying the politically weaker Woodvilles offered an opportunity for reconciliation. It also seems Edward genuinely fell in love with Elizabeth. Although he had numerous mistresses, none threatened her status while he lived. The secret nature of their marriage suggests Edward anticipated strong resistance from the nobility to his choice of bride. An early announcement might have endangered Elizabeth's family, making secrecy a practical necessity. In the end, Edward waited for the right moment to reveal his marriage, after Warwick had nearly finalized his negotiations for a French alliance. Whether the marriage occurred on April 30th or shortly before September 28th ultimately makes little difference. What matters is the profound impact this union had, not just on Edward's reign, but on English history as a whole. Elizabeth and Edward's wedding ultimately set the stage for the next significant marriage. Warwick had repeatedly asked Edward for permission to marry one of his daughters to one of Edward's brothers. Ideally, he wanted both daughters to marry into the royal family. However, Edward consistently rejected these requests. Richard was still too young and living in the kingmaker's household, while George was Edward's heir to the throne until the birth of his son. If George married into the Warwick family, he would also become heir to one of the largest inheritances in the kingdom, a situation Edward found undesirable. By 1469, tensions between the brothers, as well as between the king and the kingmaker, had escalated dramatically. Warwick convinced George to marry without Edward's consent. The wedding party sailed to Calais, where Warwick had served as captain for years, and had only brought his family back to England in 1464. With sufficient support and strong ties to the French royal court, bolstered by his former position and secret payments from the French, Warwick was prepared to openly oppose the king. Edward, for his part, may not have been fully aware of Warwick's covert dealings with France. A papal dispensation was required for the marriage and was obtained in March 1469, despite Edward's objections. This led many historians to question the degree of secrecy surrounding the event, as the wedding was relatively public. The ceremony was officiated by Isabel's uncle, George Neville, the Archbishop of York, who had served as Edward's chancellor until 1467. Most accounts suggest the wedding took place at Notre Dame in Calais. George Emilius Crauchet Sandeman wrote, "In 1469, another magnificent marriage thrilled Calais society when George, Duke of Clarence, wedded Isabella, the kingmaker's daughter, thus sealing the revolt against Edward IV. This marriage was celebrated by the Archbishop of York in Notre Dame." However, Sandeman's credibility, as previously noted, is questionable. St. Peter's and St. Mary's are also considered possible venues for the wedding. Christy Dean, in The World of Richard III, argues that the ceremony likely occurred in St. Mary's, as it would have drawn the most public attention. Dean also notes that 5 knights of the Garter, along with other lords and ladies, were present. However, she does not name these individuals or cite her sources. The Earl of Oxford is likely to have been among those in attendance. The date of the wedding is uncertain, with both July 11th and July 12th, 1469, appearing in various sources. It's possible that both dates are correct. Wavrin, who hoped to gain access to valuable information from Warwick for his Chronicle of England, recorded that the celebrations began on July 11th and lasted 2 days. However, the festivities were relatively modest, as there were not many people. Thomas Penn, in The Brothers York, suggests the venue was deserted and that the celebrations were clearly cobbled together. Returning to Wavrin's account, he noted that Warwick barely answered his request for assistance with his chronicle. Instead, Warwick gave him a fine horse and sent him away, leading Wavrin to suspect that big things were in motion. His suspicions were confirmed just 1 day after the festivities ended, when George Warwick and George Neville issued a proclamation targeting Edward and the Woodvilles. It is worth noting that the name Eleanor Talbot did not surface in this context. Warwick and George either did not know of her alleged relationship with Edward, or deemed the story too dubious to weaponize against him. Instead, they spread a more damaging rumor that Edward was the illegitimate son of an archer, thereby questioning his claim to the throne. The subsequent events are well known. The attempt to replace Edward with George failed, prompting Warwick to form a pact with Margaret of Anjou. Warwick married his daughter Anne to Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, and restored Henry VI to the throne. George, however, defected back to his brothers. Edward reclaimed the throne, with Richard remaining steadfastly loyal to his side. During the ensuing conflicts, both Warwick and Edward of Westminster were killed. This created a complex dilemma for Edward IV. There was no attainder against Warwick, meaning his estates could not be confiscated by the crown. Instead, the properties fell to Warwick's heirs, his daughters and his wife, Anne Beauchamp. However, The latter fled to a church sanctuary and was later declared legally dead by Parliament. Anne Neville, Warwick's younger daughter and only 15 years old at the time, was too young to claim her inheritance. She fell under the guardianship of her closest male relative, her brother-in-law George, Duke of Clarence, who was married to her sister Isabel. This placed George in effective control of Warwick's estates, making him the de facto sole heir. Edward IV may have forgiven George and welcomed him back, but it was an entirely different matter to see George emerge as the most powerful baron in the kingdom. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, likely had similar concerns. Edward had entrusted Richard with securing royal authority in the north, but George's new control of extensive estates in the region made him a natural rival. It is probable that Richard approached the king early on with the proposal of marrying Anne Neville, thereby gaining control over her inheritance and significantly limiting George's power. Edward IV welcomed the idea as it resolved his own political problems. George, however, strongly opposed it. This led to a heated dispute between the brothers, culminating in both Richard and George traveling with large armed entourages for fear of attack by the other. The king became increasingly involved to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. George initially agreed to permit the marriage on the condition that Richard and Anne completely renounce their claim to the inheritance. Richard rejected this proposal outright. What happened next is difficult to piece together due to contradictory accounts, but it is known that Richard sought out Anne. According to one version of events, George claimed he did not know where Anne was. Richard, mistrusting him, launched his own search and eventually found her in the household of one of George's retainers, disguised as a kitchen maid. Richard then took Anne to St. Martin's Sanctuary. This account is detailed in the Croyland Chronicle. Following these events, negotiations finally reached a breakthrough, and an agreement was reached on how to divide Warwick's estates between the parties. Some sources suggest this agreement was reached before Richard located Anne, but it seems more likely that George, having lost control of Anne, was forced to compromise. Without an agreement, Richard could have married Anne with Edward's blessing and claimed the entire inheritance. Edward had made it clear he fully supported his younger brother in this matter. Once the family disputes were resolved, there were no further obstacles to the marriage. It likely took place between May 5, 1472, and April 7, 1473, with some records suggesting July 12, 1472. However, the exact date remains uncertain. Following the death of her first husband, Edward of Westminster, on May 4, 1471, Anne observed the customary mourning period of 1 year, meaning she could not remarry before May 5, 1472. By April 8, 1473, Anne is referred to as the Duchess of Gloucester in a statute, suggesting the marriage had been consummated by this point. Richard required several papal dispensations to marry Anne. Whether he obtained all of them is a matter of debate between Ricardian and non-Ricardian historians. Both sides agree that Richard needed a dispensation because he was related to Anne's first husband. He received it on April 22, 1472. Michael Hicks argues that a second dispensation was also necessary because Richard and Anne were brother and sister-in-law through George's and Isabel's marriage. Ricardians, including Annette Carson and Marie Barnfield, dispute this claim, arguing that the second dispensation was unnecessary. However, neither side addresses another required dispensation. Richard and Anne were closely related themselves. Richard's mother, Cecily Neville, was Anne's father's aunt. It appears Richard chose to proceed with the marriage without waiting for this dispensation, which, to the best of our knowledge, was never granted. The wedding ceremony likely took place in St. Stephen's Chapel at the Palace of Westminster, although the officiant and other attendees remain unknown. Given Edward and Elizabeth's evident support for the marriage, it is possible they were present, but this is not confirmed. The absence of a dispensation is evident in the final agreement, which Parliament approved. It guaranteed that Richard would retain control of the estates even if the marriage was later declared invalid. Whether this was a love match is a question that persists. From Anne's perspective, the situation is telling. She was a young widow, the daughter of a defeated house, and destitute. Richard likely knew her for most of his life, and was the only man capable of standing up to George in the dispute over her inheritance. For Anne, feelings were secondary. She had no viable alternative but to marry Richard. Richard's search for Anne lends a romantic air to the story in hindsight. It is possible that genuine affection developed between them, but their marriage was undeniably a political alliance. The marriages of the York brothers became a cautionary tale for the political actors of their time, a lesson in how not to handle matrimonial alliances. Edward IV arranged for his young son, Richard, to marry the even younger Anne Mowbray in a grand public spectacle at Westminster while he was still a toddler. Edward's own secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville served as an accusation against him in Titulus Regius, which emphasized the necessity of not just formalizing a union, but ensuring it was publicly witnessed. This awareness influenced Henry VII, who deliberately made his marriage to Elizabeth of York a highly visible celebration. Secret weddings could easily become weapons. Combined with the forces of power and wealth, they had the potential to poison family dynamics. The history of the York brothers' marriages serves as a prime example of this danger. Ultimately, the circumstances surrounding their unions contributed to the ruin of their entire family. Henry VIII understood this lesson all too well. His struggle to secure recognition for his marriage to Anne Boleyn, and the legitimacy of the children from that marriage, was shaped, at least in part, by the memory of Edward IV's sons and the fallout from his marriage. The fact that Henry annulled his marriage to Anne before her execution was not only an act of political maneuvering, but also a way to avoid the mandatory mourning period before marrying Jane Seymour. It's not far-fetched to think that Richard and Anne's story may have influenced his actions. Each of the York brothers, Edward, George, and Richard, had their own reasons for marrying as they did. These motivations varied greatly, yet they resulted in striking similarities in how their weddings unfolded. None of their marriages were simple. They all faced significant challenges, showing that even the most powerful were not immune to the destructive forces of the Wars of the Roses. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to help my channel.